Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Topical Thursday. Our special guest this afternoon is Mr. Andrew Rock. Andrew is a neuropsychologist that works at Concord Hospital and Sydney Local Health District, and he's going to be talking to us this afternoon about the importance of neuropsych assessments after stroke. So Andrew is a neuropsychologist who has worked with adults and older adults with psychiatric and neurological conditions for almost 20 years. He has a particular interest in addressing rehabilitation issues and drawing on patients' neuropsychological findings to inform management recommendations and decisions around individuals' potential to return to activities such as work and study. It's great to have Andrew with us this afternoon, as this is an area that has been of particular interest to our members.
So I guess an obvious starting point is when people are in hospital, it's such an overwhelming experience often. So many people want to talk to you, so many people want to do similar things with you. It's difficult to keep track of, I imagine. So even those of you who have seen a neuropsych might have been a little bit bewildered about their role was. Briefly, what we do is try and use objective tests as well as observations to try and work out a couple of key things for people after things such as stroke. One of the big ones is, what's the pattern of their difficulties and how significant are the problems? You don't just want to know about problems though, it's also a really important thing to learn about strengths as well, about ways that people can maybe compensate and capitalise on what they've still got going for them. So we also talk about the pattern and so the severity of the problems with the systems that are likely affected and advice on what we can do about it. So there are a couple of key questions that we look at from a neuropsych perspective. Some of them are surprisingly relevant, others not so much. The first issue, I guess, is what has happened to cause the damage. Funny enough, it doesn't actually matter critically in terms of issues like return to work from a neuropsych perspective what the cause was. The cause is relevant in that we're interested in how it's going to interact with other factors, but what really matters is the bits that have been impacted and whereabouts in the brain they are. Another really important, so I guess more important in some ways, is where the damage is, where the affected site is. So everything in Sydney is about real estate, they say sometimes. It's all about location, 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 and it's the same thing in some ways in terms of people's recovery from stroke, in terms of what's been impacted by stroke. Knowing where the damage is helps you know what's likely to be affected and what you can likely do, what's likely to be intact and how you can work around it. Another important issue is the when, how long ago this happened. That's really useful to know in terms of, it gives you a sense of how early in a person's recovery are they, how far down the track are they. Some things are going to bounce back naturally of their own accord at a given time, and unfortunately some things aren't going to. It's important to understand how far along a person's recovery they are. When you've got all that, you can come up with some comments around things like a person's ability to drive again, their ability to resume responsibilities like study or work, their ability to make decisions and so on. Okay. One of the other issues I'll touch on briefly is the difference between a neuropsych assessment and cognitive screening. So when you see your GP after stroke, or when you see nurses in hospital, they may well run through something. They may well run through their own version of cognitive screening with you. That's really helpful. It's a little bit different from what we do in a couple of ways. One of the main differences of neuropsychology, I guess, is just how comprehensively we try and do it, and the comparisons we make. So on the screen here, we've got two different pictures of fruit. The one on the left is a picture of fruit salad, and the one on the right is specific types of fruit. So when you go and see a doctor or a nurse for cognitive screening,
I think we've lost you actually, Andrew. We can't hear you speaking, right? Is there a problem there, or is it just me?
they're sort of taking the fruit salad approach to cognitive testing. It's useful, but what they're saying is this a big piece of world, basically? Whereas a neuropsychologist will try and compare you in your own context. knowing your level of education and knowing your age and your cultural background are all important things to give a really detailed insight of how you're traveling compared to what we'd expect. So one of the things we spend a lot of time rabbiting on about with the people we see is their level of education. And the reason for that is it's really relevant. So for example, there's a screening measure that's commonly given that's scored out of 30, and people say, okay, well, 24 out of 30, that's not a great score. In point of fact, it all depends on the context. For a relatively young person with good education, 24 out of 30 might be a terrible score, whereas for an older person who hasn't had the chance to have much schooling, it can be actually a reasonable outcome. The language people speak impacts to a surprising extent on how they're likely to perform on a testing. So just to give you a simple example, the average number of words that people who speak Vietnamese can say in a minute is around about 20, whereas a Spanish speaker, it's around about 14. That's not to say that Spanish speakers are less bright, less verbally fluent. Simply the words are longer. The words take longer to pronounce in Spanish than Vietnamese. So you need to understand a person's education, the person's context, and also the language the person is speaking to get a sense of, are these numbers valid? Are they really, am I making a fair comparison here? Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to do now is just give you a little bit of an insight into the process of neuropsych testing, what we actually do. First thing we do is, when you see a neuropsychologist, is start off spending some time going over the history with you, getting an idea of the sorts of things you were doing before you had the stroke. We'll talk to you, we'll talk perhaps to people that know you well, and then we'll get down to brass tacks and we'll do the testing. And we break up testing into different areas of cognitive skills. We look at attention and speed and what your memory's like. We look at what you like for things you've seen, what you like with language, and what you like at problem solving and organising your behaviour. Then we do a couple of things once we've got all that information. We compare that information with how you were probably travelling before you had the stroke and with the general population, and also with a relevant group. So if the issue is returning to work, we would try and compare your results with the results of people who are probably in a similar sort of area to yourself. Okay, so the first thing we look at would be attention. Now, there's all different sorts. There's simple attention. That's just, for example, if I read you a string of numbers, how many of those numbers can you hold in your head at once and give back to me? And working memory is a slightly more complicated version. We're looking at there whether you're able to hold that information in your head while you're getting distracted. So, for example, if you're going into a shop and there are 5 things you want to buy, and you run into a friend on the way in, you chat to your friend, and then you find yourself in the store, can you still remember what you wanted to get? Very common problem is losing, to some extent after a stroke, losing that ability to just sort of hold things in your head despite distractions. We look at concentration, because that's a biggie in terms of people's ability to return to work. How long can you keep your mind focused on something? And if I can make the technology work now, I'll show you a little video on selective attention. So in the activity here, you need to count how often the people wearing white pass the basketball.
Oh, here we go. Oh.
Just concentrate on the people in white. Count how many times they're passing the basketball to each other. Ignore the ones in black, just focus on the ones in white. A few seconds longer. Okay.
I'm not answering.
So, a couple of questions. How many passes did people see? And how many gorillas did people see?
Not a one.
Why don't we go back and watch this again? So this is an exercise in selective attention. It's an exercise in people's ability to tune out everything apart from the thing they're focusing on. So I'll take it back to the beginning. And this time, don't count the number of basketball passes. I want you to count the number of great big hairy mammals. It's exactly the same video. But we're not doing that. We're counting how many forest dwellers how many forest dwellers pass our screen. Exact same video you watched a minute ago. Good news and bad news. If you're one of the people that saw the gorilla, then that says you'd be a terrific witness. You're very good at noticing what's going on around you. And the good news for the other people who didn't notice the gorilla, and I've got to tell you, I didn't see it either the first time I saw that video. The good news for the rest of you is you've got a real strength in selective attention, in tuning out everything that's not relevant to the task at hand. So it's one of those glass half full things. If you saw it, terrific. If you didn't see it, that's a good outcome too. So that's an example of selective attention. Okay. Now, another thing we look at is how quickly people process information. It doesn't sound all that interesting. It's a very useful thing to know. It's got all kinds of real world applications. So for example, how quickly, really, it's a key requirement for certain types of job. It's relevant when you're driving and so on. And we can measure that in a whole lot of ways. We can measure it by getting you to do symbol copying down tasks, or by how quickly you can read. There's another thing called inspection time, which we sometimes use. So here you see two figures, and one of them's got a long leg on the left, a long leg on the right. Show them the picture for a brief little period of time, and then you cover up the legs, and you say to the person, okay, was the long leg the one on the left or the right? It's a really simple activity. That's all they've got to do. They can take as long as they want to decide, but you only show the picture for a little amount of time. And how much time a person needs to make a call and get it right, maybe 50% of the time, maybe 75% of the time, that's a useful way of judging how quickly they're processing that information. Now, memory is another thing we spend a lot of time looking at. Basically, there are two sorts of memory. There's memory for things that we can put into words, and there's memory for things that we actually do. The things that we're more likely to focus on in a neuropsych assessment with someone who's had a stroke are, first of all, what's their memory like for verbal information, for things that they hear, and what's their memory like for things that they see. Because those two things might be pretty similar in someone, but there's a very good chance after a stroke they're going to be quite different, and it's really useful to know which one is more helpful for the person. Another thing we look at is, what are they like at grabbing information that you tell them in a structured kind of way, like a little story, versus in an unstructured way, when you might just read them a list of words that don't have anything to do with each other. And you can look at things like what they're like at remembering information by themselves, or when you give them a little cue, or when you ask people, which one of these two things did I show you before, which is their ability to recognize information you've come across previously. Okay, so another thing you might do is get people to remember stuff that you see. You can give them a story, you can give them a list of words. You might just show them things like, for example, look at that picture in the bottom right corner, got a couple of blue dots. Get someone to remember where those dots were later on a screen. What color were they, where were they, that kind of thing. Another thing we look at is people's ability to make sense of the visual world around them. A couple of things we look at there. One thing is people's ability just to process the world accurately. So perception. For example, there's in this picture here, if you get damage to a certain area of your brain and you show this and someone shows you these two pictures, you're going to have a lot of trouble putting into words why they're different. If you get a stroke in the wrong area of your brain, you might say, well, I reckon I would rather live in the house on the right, typically, but people aren't sure why. People wouldn't be able to tell you. It's because the one on the left is on fire, because the ability to perceive and the link into conscious awareness has been affected. That's not a test we actually do terribly often. A more realistic one would be a perceptual test like this, when there's a whole array of lines down the bottom and a couple of lines up top. And what you would do to the person is say, okay, tell me, which one of those lines up the top matches one of the lines down the bottom? For example, is it number 5 that's pointing the same direction as the first of those lines? And is it maybe number 10 or number 9 or number 8? What do you reckon? It's the one pointing the same direction as the other line.
Mm-hmm.
And you might get them to copy figures for you. You might get them to copy patterns either with blocks or with pen and paper, based on a little picture you'd show them. Okay, I'm going to get everyone to do now, as a practical exercise, one of the things we might look at. So there's another thing called apraxia. Now, apraxia is a person's difficulty putting into practice a fairly familiar movement. It's when a person knows what they've got to do and the muscles are intact that would let them do it. But because a stroke maybe has affected the brain, they can't actually get it happening. Now, I don't want to give you a real test for this, but I'll give you a little example. So I want everyone now to just make clockwise circles with your right foot. So just sit comfortably, lift your right foot up, just make clockwise circles with it. Okay, you can stop. And now I want you to trace the number 6 in the air for me. Just lift your hand up, trace the number 6 as though you're drawing it in the sky for me. Okay, so we know now that you can make clockwise circles with your right foot and you can trace the number 6. There's no problem with those muscles. But here's where it gets tricky. Stay where you are. I want you to lift your right foot off the floor now and make those clockwise circles. But at the same time as you're doing that, I want you to draw the number 6 in the air with your right hand. So start doing that, start doing your number 6s, and tell me what happens to the direction of your foot. Is your foot suddenly going the other way?
Yes.
It doesn't work on everyone, but it works on a whole lot of people, including me. So that's a little example of what apraxia feels like. You understand what you're meant to be doing, and your muscles have got the ability to do it. But for some reason, there's a crossed wire in your brain, maybe after a stroke. And for whatever reason, you're not able to make those things come together for you. Okay. Another thing we look at is language. Language is important. It's got all kinds of real-world significance in a job setting, in a social setting. Your ability to make yourself understood and your ability to understand other people. Now, we can measure all kinds of things about language. You can measure vocabulary, you can measure how well people use grammar, you can measure all sorts of things. This is a funny sort of example. Someone did some of these tests, applied to the speeches of US presidents in over the last, I guess 20 odd years or so. And they looked at them and they looked at how complicated was their vocabulary, the words they're using, and their grammatical structure. And so, for example, Donald Trump gets a whole lot of bad press about not being the brightest guy. And we can see, well, in his speeches, he's typically pitching himself at a grade 6 level, about the level of a kid who's in a 12-year-old, someone who's completing year 6 at school. And his grammar is around about the same. You know, there have been, he's not as bad in some ways as G.W. Bush, but he's not traveling too well. Just an interesting little side of the sorts of things that we can measure. Of course, this is just for fun. When we're testing people, we're doing something different. When we're testing people, we're looking at real-world application. Is there a problem with verbal expression? Is there a problem with comprehension? And how are those likely to play out? Okay, so here are examples of tests that we might actually do. One of the common things that happens to people after a stroke is more difficulty getting the word you want to say. Happens to us all sometimes. Happens to me sometimes in the course of this talk. There's a word you want to say, it's on the tip of your tongue, the damn thing doesn't come when you call it. You'll get it later, you just don't get it right then and there. You can measure how big an issue this is for people by just showing them pictures of things. You start off with easy things that most Australians are going to get, like the picture on the left is a kangaroo. And you can finish up showing really complicated things that just about no one's going to get. That picture in the top right-hand corner, it's an animal that you find in Africa. And it's the strangest thing you're ever going to see. It's got striped legs like a zebra. It's got a body like a donkey. It looks for all the world like a make-believe animal or an animal someone's painted just for fun. And yet, it really is a thing. And so, you wouldn't expect anyone's going to get that one right. You would expect most people are going to get the kangaroo right, and most people are going to fall somewhere in between. It helps you work out to what extent people are going to struggle for words when they're speaking, when they're trying to communicate at work settings maybe. Another thing you can look at is the link between the concepts and the words So we've got a picture here. There's a pyramid in a square, and below it there are two trees. One of them's a Christmas tree, one of them's a date tree. One of those trees you'd find in the desert where the pyramids are, and the other one you wouldn't. You can ask people, just tell me which tree goes with this picture. That's another way of looking at how intact language is. And the last thing we look at is executive functioning. So executive functioning it's a whole lot of things. Some of those are sort of mental processes, like cognitive processes, and some of them are control of behavior. So executive functioning is your problem solving, your higher order reasoning, and so on. Can you use logic to solve problems? Can you generate ideas, and so on? And the other thing is people's ability to organize their behavior. Can you work out useful strategies and make yourself stick to those strategies when you're trying to achieve your goals? Do you keep on making the same mistake over and over? Do you tend to be too impulsive? You know the right thing, but you just go with your reflex behavior all the time anyway. Okay. So some of the things we look at would be flexibility in terms of the cognitive side of things. Can a person easily move between different sort of mental sets, or do they get stuck talking about a topic? So, for example, I might ask you to move backwards and forwards between giving me example between, say, the day.
Rachel, has Andrew frozen?
Yes, can't hear him.
So we've lost Andrew for the moment. Hopefully he'll come back. I'm really enjoying this. I'm not passing it, but I'm really enjoying it.
I think the internet might be playing up a little bit. So hopefully it'll kick back in a second.
Okay. Are you there, Andrew?
Yep.
Sorry, we lost you there for a little while, love.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Hopefully the slide speaks for itself a little bit. One of the things you look at is people's ability to move easily from one sort of idea to another, to use logic to solve problems and to come up with solutions. And you can also look at behavior. You can do something like change a person, get a person used to responding in a certain way, and then all of a sudden you change it and you see, can you flexibly switch? Can you stop the behavior and that you're used to and start doing something you're not used to? Okay, big question. How do you know what's bad and how bad it is? You can do that in a couple of ways. If you go and see your GP or a nurse and they do cognitive testing, they'll probably use a score that says everyone above this score is okay, everyone below that score is in trouble. To give an example, you've got a picture here of a boat on Niagara Falls. Now, right where that boat is, it doesn't have a care in the world. It hasn't gone over the waterfall. It's just sitting comfortably on the river. Right now, on that side of the line, on that side of the score, everything.
You've gone again, Andrew,
Okay.
I'm afraid.
But if it moves a tiny little bit to the left, it's all going to go wrong. So neuroscience. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Am I back?
Yeah, you are, Andrew.
Just put your hand up when I'm.
Sorry, everyone, even Michelle's been kicked off, I think.
That's ready. So neuropsychologists don't use cuts. They can write everything. Okay. So what a neuropsychologist would try and do would be compare a person with a group, with a relevant group. So if the issue is returning to work, you would say, what are the other people doing that job likely to be? Where are they likely to be cognitively? For example, if you're evaluating a doctor and their capacity to return to work. Everyone is going, most doctors, something like, I don't know, about 120 at least on an IQ test. Typically, you'd be expecting them to score about 2 standard deviations better than everyone else. And so for them, an average score can be a terrible result in terms of their ability to practice. That's not an issue for other people. For other people, you'd be trying matching them in relevant areas. So I'll come up with a concrete example for you. So to give you an example of how it might all play out, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. To give an example of how it all might play out, recently I saw a young gentleman who wanted to go back to return to work as a stockbroker. Wanted to return to work as a stockbroker, and like most of us, he had a mix of strengths and weaknesses. Now, his strengths were considerable. He was a really personable guy. He was a delight to talk to. He was confident and he was articulate and he presented as smart. And his memory was good for things that he was familiar with. Not for new facts, but information that he had from long ago, he was terrific at. And he had a number of weaknesses too. The weaknesses this gentleman had were he tended to make careless mistakes. He was a little bit slow processing new information, and he didn't do well under time pressure. Wasn't great at learning new information, wasn't great at solving new problems. And a real issue for this guy, unfortunately, was he had a real tendency to make careless mistakes. So putting that together from my point of view, I thought, this gentleman, unfortunately, does not seem well suited to go back to stockbroking. He's not able to think quickly on his feet. He's not terribly reliable with numbers. He makes careless mistakes all the time, and he gets tired quite quickly. Returning to work as a stockbroker didn't seem like a great idea. On the other hand, he had some genuine strengths. As I mentioned, he came across as a warm, confident, bright man. He was good at talking about things he was familiar with, and he had reasonable energy over the short period. So from my perspective, the results suggested that while returning to work as a stockbroker wasn't likely to be a goer, I think there was every reason in the world to think that he was going to go reasonably well in a field like sales, where he could draw on his strengths and bypass his weaknesses. My other recommendation for this fellow was that he work on a part-time basis, at least initially, because he was good over short periods of time, but he was a sprinter. He wasn't a long-distance runner anymore. Working part-time in a field like sales struck me as a really good option for him. Now, having said that, the neuropsychologist's job is not to play God. It's not to say a person can do this and they can't do this. We don't play God, but we do some. I guess our role is more like being a weatherman when you talk about the chances of rain. So I could say, I don't know if he's going to succeed or not as a stockbroker, but I think there's a really high chance we're setting him up to fail if he returns to that field. On the other hand, I think it's quite likely, it's quite probable he would do well in another field that would let him draw on his strengths, such as sales. And I guess, in a nutshell, that's my perspective as a neuropsychologist on what we would be looking for in a neuropsych assessment. Now, there are a couple of things that I would touch on as strategies which are useful for all people. One of the things everyone wants to know is, how can I get better? The thing about neuropsych testing, as we've been saying, is it's all about matching apples with apples. It's difficult to generalize. There are simple strategies people can do to help themselves maximize their mental strengths. One of those, and they tend to be simple things, they're often lifestyle things, and often they're the sorts of things that your mum told you. Make sure that you eat in a healthy way. Get your fruit and veg, your body needs them and your brain needs them, especially after something like a stroke. Right? Don't go crazy with alcohol. When our brains have been affected, small things make it harder to function efficiently. Alcohol is not a bad thing for many people, unless you're having it too much. Another thing that's super important after something like a stroke is getting plenty of sleep and plenty of rest. That can be easier to say than to actually get. We've all had the experience of lying there tossing and turning at 2 in the morning. You're trying, but you can't. The sleep's not coming. Whether or not you're able to sleep, you can make it more likely you'll sleep by setting up good practices, like trying to have regular routines when you go to bed, when you get up, avoiding screen time, avoiding social media, maybe for an hour before you go to sleep, is going to help. And getting plenty of exercise through the day is critical, especially for people recovering from things such as stroke. I'm not talking about taking a 2-hour sleep necessarily, although if that works for you, then do it. But I might just be talking about taking a few minutes off. Give yourself a chance to unplug for a couple of minutes, an hour maybe, stand up and walk around. For those people lucky enough to still be able to exercise following a stroke, exercise is terrific. You don't want to go crazy. You don't want to try and start running ultra marathons. You want to talk to your GP about it. But for people who are lucky enough to be able to exercise, it's great for the brain. It helps get rid of the garbage, basically, that our brains produce when we think. Exercise also has a terrific impact on mood. And if there's time, there's another strategy I'll come back to, which is meditation. Something I'll mention before I come to that one is there are real benefits from trying to keep yourself mentally active. You've got to choose the right race for yourself. You've got to choose something that's within your limits and within your interests. But for a lot of people, there's a whole range of things we can do to keep mentally active, to keep the brain ticking over. And a lot of those things happily take the form of games. Games such as cards, for example, or crosswords, or those Sudoku puzzles, terrific things for your brain. They're kind of fun. They don't last forever. They're an excellent activity to improve your efficiency. Some people find reading or playing music are wonderful things to do after some sort of brain injury, including stroke. If you're able to use your hands, that's obviously going to work. That's a consideration. Find an activity that works well for you. And the good news is simple stuff like talking to people is terrific. It's a wonderful form of mental exercise as well. We don't realize how much energy, how much work goes into things that seem simple to us. Things like walking is one of the most complicated things you'll do, because what you're doing is throwing yourself off balance and catching yourself again and again and again. Similarly with talking. Leaving aside the physical mechanics of speaking, which can be demanding enough, just participating in a conversation is wonderful mental exercise because you're using those skills we talked about before. You're using attention, and you're using your working memory and your language skills and your reasoning to judge, is this relevant or not, and your impulse to control in terms of, is it your turn to talk or not? It's another wonderful activity. As I touched on, meditation is a terrific thing also. If there's time, I'll invite one of my colleagues perhaps just to run through a brief exercise with you. And we'll see how we go from a time perspective. That, I think, is all I had to say about neuropsychology and return to work from stroke, but I'm very happy to field any questions people might have.
That was tremendous. Thank you, Andrew. I really enjoy that. I guess from my perspective, we really do fear neuropsych exams. It's one of those things as we get older even, that, you know that people are going to judge us by is our ability to think and to process information. And so when the idea of a neuropsych exam comes up, most of us will get quite anxious about it. And I guess the relaxation and meditation that you're talking about is probably one of those ways that that we can offset that process before we sit the exam. I am going to ask you, though, the pertinent question: is there any way to cheat on a neuropsych? I am going to ask it because I'm looking to find out any clue I can. Okay.
Let me start off by saying I totally get that thing about the anxiety of it. I hate getting tested. I don't even like going to the optometrist. There's a thing about another person evaluating you, which is really threatening. It kind of challenges our sense of ourselves. We've all got strengths and weaknesses. If we're lucky, we've come to terms with who we are. But it's another thing when you think another person is sort of sitting there and they're just judging you. And frankly, everything about the neuropsych room is making that even more intense, even tougher. There's the stopwatch side of it. There's the clipboard side of it. It's not your own environment. It's a threatening place to be. And I try to make it as much like a conversation as I can, but I really sympathise. It's an experience I would find personally challenging to go through. In terms of cheating, no, there aren't there aren't ways of cheating as such that I'm going to talk about with you. I guess that's why I was touching at the end on those strategies which are going to help make us think more efficiently generally. There are things you can't really cram for a neuropsych exam. They're going to be things hopefully from outside people's direct experience. But you can do things to make sure that your brain is running as efficiently as it can. It's going to vary from person to person, but as efficiently as you can. So the stuff about trying to get enough sleep is important. The stuff about practicing mindful techniques, such as a psychologist could teach you to help you relax in that room. About telling the neuropsychologist, I'm sorry, I'm really stressed here, I just need a minute to collect yourself maybe. Letting them know if you're getting really fatigued. So a neuropsychologist want to see the best you can do. They don't want it to be a test you're going to fail. They want it to be a test that will show what actually are you like at this. Because we're all different. We've all got strengths and weaknesses. Where do you personally fall? They want you to have it they want you to give it a red hot go. And if they notice you're getting too tired, they'll say, you know what, that's enough for today. Let's finish off. Let's reschedule. But you should tell them if you're experiencing that kind of difficulty yourself. If you feel yourself you've just run out, you're suddenly on empty, let them know, and they'll schedule a brief break or maybe get back to it again later on. But the stuff about looking after yourself, it's going to help you in the exam. The stuff about eating right, getting plenty of sleep and rest, spending time talking to people, spending time on meaningful activities like little mental challenges, reading, music, whatever, all those things are going to help.